You're in garage doors? Interesting. A consultant at a networking mixer said it the way people say interesting when they mean small. Must be steady work, I guess. Not exactly scalable, though, right? No offense, but I pictured someone a little more polished, I guess. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Tommy Mello had heard some version of that sentence 100 times by then. Standing in rooms full of people who ran software companies and investment funds, watching their eyes glaze over the second he said garage doors, watching them mentally file him under a ceiling they'd already decided existed before he'd said another word. A guy who paints doors and answers service calls. Blue collar, small time, not exactly scalable. He never argued with them in the room. He just went back to work, the same way he'd been going back to work since he was a kid, clearing driveways in the snow for whatever a neighbor was willing to pay him. This is the story of how a kid from a broken home in Detroit, who started out shoveling snow and mowing lawns for spare change, built the single largest independently owned garage door company in North America, scaling it toward a valuation north of $1 billion, one skeptical room, one dismissive comment, and one underestimated invoice at a time. The kid who already knew how to work, Tommy Mello, grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in a household that split apart early. His parents divorced when he was 7 years old, and from that point on, it was largely his mother holding the family together financially, working hard, stretching every dollar, keeping the lights on through years where money was never something anyone in that house took for granted. Kids who grow up watching a parent carry that kind of quiet, relentless weight tend to absorb one of two lessons. Either money feels permanently unstable and frightening, or it starts to feel like something you go get yourself, because waiting for it to show up on its own clearly isn't a strategy that works. Tommy went with the second lesson, early and instinctively. As a kid, he was already out shoveling snow and mowing lawns for whatever neighbors would pay him. Small jobs, small money. But his first real exposure to a simple, foundational truth that would define the rest of his career. Show up, do the work, get paid, and the next job usually shows up because of how you did the last one. It's not a complicated business philosophy. It's just one that most people stop actively practicing somewhere around adolescence. Tommy Mello never really stopped. Detroit in that era wasn't an easy place for a kid to grow up watching money get stretched thin. It was a city that had already seen significant portions of its industrial base contract. A place where the gap between families who were comfortable and families who were genuinely struggling was visible on almost every block. Tommy's mother did what a huge number of single parents in that position do, absorbing the stress quietly, working consistently, and making sure her kids never fully understood how close to the edge some months actually were. He's spoken since about how much of his own work ethic traces directly back to watching her do that, not as an inspirational speech delivered to him directly, but simply as the ambient, everyday texture of what it looked like for a parent to refuse to let hardship become an excuse. There was no trust fund waiting at 18. There was no family business to inherit a foothold in. Whatever Tommy Mello was eventually going to build, he was going to have to build entirely from whatever hustle he could generate himself. One lawn, one driveway. One small job at a time, starting years before anyone would have described what he was doing as entrepreneurship, rather than just a kid trying to make some extra money. The accidental start Tommy eventually made his way to Arizona, and the path that led him into garage doors specifically was almost entirely accidental, which is true of a lot of origin stories that end up sounding, in hindsight, like they were inevitable. He needed extra income, and he had a roommate who happened to work as a manager for a garage door company, close enough exposure to the industry to notice a gap nobody else seemed to be filling efficiently. Tommy started painting garage doors on the side, a simple enough service, faded and weathered doors refreshed for homeowners who didn't want to replace the whole unit. He didn't overthink the scaling. He went on Craigslist, found a painter willing to do the physical work, and built a simple operational rhythm around it. 10 doors painted on Saturday, 10 more on Sunday. $2,000 a week, generated on the weekends, from a service most people in his life would have described, if they'd bothered to ask, as beneath serious consideration. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of business idea that gets funded on a pitch deck. It was simply profitable, repeatable, and built on Tommy's willingness to notice a gap that people with more conventional ambitions had walked straight past without seeing. There's a specific kind of clarity that comes from a business this simple. No investors to manage, no board to report to. Just a clear, measurable exchange. A door gets painted, a homeowner pays, and the math either works or it doesn't. Tommy learned, in that small weekend operation, something that would end up mattering more to his eventual success than almost any single later decision. He learned to actually watch the numbers on a small scale, to understand exactly what a job cost him in time and materials against what it brought in. A habit of financial attentiveness that most people running a much larger business still never fully develop. It's a small, unglamorous foundation, but almost every big sustainable company traces back to a founder who first learned to respect the arithmetic on something this modest. Founding A1 in the hole in 2007, Tommy Mello founded A1 Garage Door Service in Phoenix, Arizona. And the beginning was nowhere near as clean as the company's later success might suggest. He started $50,000 deep in debt, a genuinely frightening hole for a young entrepreneur with no outside investors and no family wealth cushioning the fall if any of it went wrong. There was no glossy launch event. There was no press coverage. There was simply a young guy with a truck, a growing list of service calls, and a debt figure that would have convinced plenty of reasonable people to fold the whole operation and go find a steady paycheck somewhere far safer instead. He didn't fold it. Early on, Tommy brought in a business partner to help share the load, a common enough move for a founder trying to survive the earliest, most precarious years of a company that could still disappear entirely with one bad month. That partnership eventually reached a breaking point, the two of them seeing the company's direction differently enough that continuing together stopped making sense. Tommy ended up the one who kept going, inheriting both the debt and the decision of whether A1 Garage Door was worth continuing to fight for at all, alone, with nobody else's name on the line beside his. He decided it was. Within 7 years of that $50,000 hole, A1 Garage Door had grown into a business generating $30 million in annual revenue. A genuinely staggering trajectory for a company that had started with literally negative equity, and a founder who, by his own later admission, was learning most of the fundamentals of running a service business in real time, through direct, expensive trial and error, rather than through any formal business education. Those early years demanded a kind of relentlessness that doesn't photograph well in a highlight reel. Answering service calls at odd hours, personally handling jobs when a technician didn't show, making payroll some weeks by the narrowest possible margin, the specific, gut-tightening stress that anyone who has ever run a small business with real debt attached to it will recognize instantly. Tommy has since described that period candidly, not as some noble grind he's nostalgic for, but as a genuinely difficult stretch that he simply refused to let end in failure. In part because failure would have meant proving right every single person who'd already decided a garage door business was never going to be anything more than a guy with a truck and a phone number. What nobody tells you about scaling a trade business, growing a home services company from a garage door painting side hustle into a real multi-location operation, is not simply a matter of hiring more technicians and hoping revenue follows. Tommy Mello has spoken publicly and extensively in the years since about exactly how ugly and unglamorous that middle stretch of growth actually was. Loose systems in a rapidly growing service company create exactly the kind of gaps that get exploited. Technicians handling cash jobs with minimal oversight. Inventory and parts that walk out the back door faster than anyone's tracking them. Employees who quietly learn that a fast-growing operation without tight controls is an easy place to take a little extra off the top and assume nobody's counting closely enough to notice. Tommy has been candid that A1 Garage Door absorbed real losses during those growth years to exactly this kind of internal leakage, the unglamorous cost of scaling faster than your own operational discipline can keep pace with. It's the part of a growth story that almost never makes it into the highlight reel, because it doesn't photograph well and it doesn't fit neatly into a motivational quote. But it's real, and it's a cost that essentially every founder scaling a service business from a garage into a genuine regional operation has to absorb somewhere along the way, whether they talk about it publicly afterward or not. Layered on top of the internal operational battles was the external one, the specific, persistent flavor of condescension that comes from operating in what a lot of the business world quietly considers a lesser category of company. Home services. Trade work. The kind of business that gets nodded at, politely, in a room full of software founders and then immediately dismissed as fundamentally uninteresting, unscalable, unworthy of the same respect automatically extended to anything with the word tech attached to it. Tommy Mello built his entire company inside that specific headwind, treated for years by a certain slice of the business world as someone running a nice little local operation, rather than someone constructing what would eventually become one of the largest companies of its kind in the country. That condescension showed up in specific, recognizable ways. Investors who took meetings out of politeness and then quietly passed, unable to get past the unglamorous surface of the industry long enough to actually examine the underlying numbers. Peers at industry events who assumed a garage door business meant a handful of trucks and a modest six-figure income, never imagining the operation behind it was already stretching into 8 figures and climbing fast. Even skilled trade workers themselves sometimes carried an internalized version of the same bias, having absorbed for years the cultural message that trade work was a fallback rather than a genuine, ambitious career path. A perception Tommy would later spend enormous energy trying to actively reverse, both inside his own company and across the broader industry. If watching someone get quietly dismissed by an entire industry and then simply outbuild every single person who dismissed him is satisfying to you the way it's satisfying to me, subscribe to Karma Lullabies and drop a comment on what written off too early story you'd want covered next. The system underneath the growth would eventually separate A1 Garage Door from 1,000 other regional trade companies that plateau and stay small forever. Wasn't luck, and it wasn't simply hustle, although there was plenty of both involved. It was Tommy Mello's obsessive focus on building actual, repeatable systems underneath the day-to-day chaos of running service calls, the unglamorous administrative backbone that most small trade businesses never bother investing in because it doesn't feel like real work in the moment it's being built. He built out structured marketing systems designed to generate consistent lead flow rather than relying on unpredictable word of mouth. He built training programs designed to take a new hire and get them productive and trustworthy faster than the informal sink-or-swim apprenticeship model most competitors were still running on. He built financial tracking tight enough to actually catch the kind of internal leakage that had cost the company real money in its earlier, looser years. None of it was flashy. All of it was the exact infrastructure that determines whether a home services company stays a single truck and a founder's cell phone number forever, or actually becomes something that can operate across 20 states without the entire thing collapsing the moment the founder isn't personally on every call. By the time A1 Garage Door had scaled past $200 million in annual revenue, the company was operating with more than 800 employees across more than 20 states. A scale that would have been genuinely unthinkable to the version of Tommy Mello, standing $50,000 in debt in Phoenix back in 2007. The company eventually crossed the $300 million revenue mark, cementing its position as the largest independently owned garage door service company in North America. Built entirely from a weekend painting hustle and a founder who refused to accept that a trade business had a natural ceiling on how large it was allowed to become. Hiring became one of the areas Tommy invested most heavily and most publicly in reshaping. Rather than treating technician roles as low-skill, high-turnover positions to be filled as cheaply as possible, a common approach across much of the home services industry, he built compensation structures and career paths designed to make a technician job at A1 Garage Door something people actually wanted to build a long-term career around, complete with clear advancement paths into management, dispatch, sales, and eventually ownership-adjacent roles as the company grew. Turnover in the trades is notoriously brutal industry-wide, technicians burning out or drifting to the next slightly better hourly rate every year or two. Tommy treated fixing that churn not as a nice cultural bonus, but as a direct, measurable driver of the operational consistency a company needs to actually scale past a certain size without falling apart under its own growth. He also built the company's marketing and lead generation into something considerably more sophisticated than the industry norm, treating what most competitors handled as an afterthought, a listing here, a coupon mailer there, as a genuine, data-driven discipline worth investing real money and real talent into. Consistent, predictable lead flow is the single hardest thing for most trade businesses to solve, and it's usually the exact reason a company plateaus at a comfortable regional size instead of ever expanding further. Tommy's willingness to treat marketing as a core competency rather than a distraction from the real work became one of the clearest structural advantages separating A1 Garage Door from the hundreds of smaller, single-market competitors it eventually outgrew. The moment it paid everyone back in 2022, Tommy Mello completed his first major outside transaction involving the company. A deal built around nearly $30 million in EBITDA that brought new capital and partnership into A1 Garage Door's next chapter of growth. What made that moment distinct from a typical founder cash-out story was what Tommy chose to do with a meaningful piece of the proceeds. Rather than keeping the entire windfall for himself, he distributed roughly $100 million to employees from that transaction, a direct, tangible acknowledgement that the technicians, the dispatchers, and the operations staff, who had spent years actually running the calls and building the reputation the company was being valued on, deserved a real stake in what that value had become. It's worth sitting with the contrast for a second. This was a man who had spent years being quietly dismissed as running an unscalable trade business, standing at the exact moment that dismissal was proven definitively wrong, and choosing to share 9 figures of that vindication directly with the people who'd built it alongside him, rather than treating it as a solely personal victory. It's not a universal practice in business exits of that size. It was, for Tommy Mello specifically, a stated and repeated priority. Building a company that created genuine financial upside for the people doing the actual work, not just for the name on the founding paperwork. Contrast that against the broader pattern this channel keeps running into: powerful people at the top of an organization treating the people closest to the actual work as replaceable, disposable, unworthy of a real share in what they helped build. Kenneth Lay let Enron's own employees lose their retirement savings while executives quietly protected their own holdings. Elizabeth Holmes tried to bury the 2 junior employees who caught what her own board couldn't see. Tommy Mello, standing at his own version of that same fork in the road, a moment where he could have simply kept the entire windfall for himself and faced zero real consequence for doing so, chose the opposite path instead. It's not a small detail. It's arguably the clearest single data point available for what kind of founder he actually turned out to be once he had the power to choose. The part of the story that isn't finished, unlike almost every other story this channel tells. This one doesn't end with a death, a collapse, or a courtroom. Tommy Mello is still building. A1 Garage Door continues expanding, continuing to push toward a billion-dollar valuation that once would have sounded absurd for a company that started as a side hustle painting doors on Craigslist listings. He's become a visible, vocal figure in the home services industry, specifically because of that origin story. Hosting a podcast focused on helping other trade business owners professionalize and scale their own operations, and writing books aimed directly at the exact kind of skepticism he spent years absorbing personally. The assumption that blue-collar businesses are somehow a lesser category of entrepreneurship than anything with a software subscription attached to it. That advocacy isn't incidental to the story. It's arguably the most pointed response Tommy Mello has ever given to every consultant who once said interesting in that specific, diminishing tone at a networking mixer. He didn't just build a large company in a category people underestimated. He built a public platform specifically to make sure the next generation of trade business owners doesn't have to fight the same uphill battle for basic legitimacy that he spent his own 20s and 30s fighting largely alone. His podcast regularly features conversations with other home services founders, electricians, plumbers, HVAC operators, and yes, other garage door companies, walking through the exact operational, marketing, and hiring systems that took him years of expensive trial and error to figure out on his own. His books lay out the same material in more structured form, aimed squarely at the trade business owner who's currently stuck exactly where Tommy was in 2007, doing solid work, generating steady revenue, but with no clear roadmap for how a service business built on trucks and technicians actually scales past a single owner's personal capacity to manage everything himself. It's a strange kind of legacy for a guy who once painted garage doors on the weekends for $2,000, and it's exactly the legacy he seems most interested in building on purpose. He's also been vocal about the broader cultural problem underneath his own individual story, the steady, decades-long push in American education and career guidance toward 4-year degrees and white-collar paths, often at the direct expense of trade education that used to be considered a completely respectable, financially sound alternative. Tommy Mello didn't need a 4-year degree to build a company generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year. He needed a truck, a willingness to answer the phone at odd hours, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the category of work he'd landed in had a ceiling somebody else, sitting comfortably in a much cleaner office, got to decide for him. If watching someone turn their own underestimated origin story into a platform for lifting up an entire industry means something to you, tell me about it in the comments, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to Karma Lullabies, because this is exactly the kind of ongoing, still being written story this channel loves to cover. What the sneering always missed, the specific dismissal, Tommy Mello, absorbed for years, carries a particular kind of blindness worth naming directly. The assumption that a garage door company can't be a serious, scalable business isn't really an assessment of garage doors at all. It's an assessment of who tends to work in that field, whose hands get dirty, whose business cards don't say founder and CEO of anything with the word disruptive attached to it. It's the exact same instinct that made an entire town feel sorry for a groundskeeper on a lawnmower, the exact same instinct that let a legal secretary get handed dictation for 67 years without anyone asking what she actually thought about markets. Tommy Mello's version of that story simply plays out while he's still alive and actively building, watching the record get corrected in real time, which is rarer than it should be. Most of the people this channel covers get their vindication posthumously, discovered in a will or an estate filing after it's too late for anyone who doubted them to actually reckon with it face to face. Tommy gets to sit across the table from the exact same kind of skepticism he heard at 25, now running a company that dwarfs the businesses of plenty of people who once treated him like he was running something small and beneath serious conversation. The last word. For now, there isn't a tidy final chapter to put on Tommy Mello's story, because he's still writing it. Still expanding A1 garage door, still building the systems and the platform that turn a single underestimated trade business into proof that an entire category of work deserves more respect than it usually gets, in rooms full of people who've never actually done it themselves. The company continues pushing toward a valuation that would have sounded like fantasy to the version of Tommy standing in a Phoenix garage in 2007, staring down $50,000 of debt with no investors, no safety net, and no guarantee any of it would work. What makes this particular story worth telling, even without the closure a death or a courtroom verdict usually provides, is the sheer distance between where it started and where it currently stands, and the fact that the man at the center of it is still there, still working, still expanding, to see every single mile of that distance clearly for himself. Most of the people this channel covers only get vindicated after it's too late for them to enjoy it. Tommy Mello gets to watch his own record get corrected in real time, one skeptical room at a time, one expanding state at a time, $100 million distributed to the people who earned it right alongside him. What there is, instead of a tidy ending, is a clear documented arc from $50,000 in debt in a Phoenix garage to the largest independently owned garage door company in North America, built by a kid who learned, shoveling snow in Detroit as a child, that nobody was going to hand him anything, and decided that was fine, because he was going to go build it himself. Every consultant who ever said interesting in that particular diminishing tone is welcome to look up the current valuation anytime they'd like a more complete answer.